Welcome to Dream Stories by Dasha, your space for sleep, calm, and gentle night stories. Here you will find everything for your best sleep. If you enjoy this channel, don't forget to subscribe and like this video so you don't lose this place of peace. Now, close your eyes and slowly let go. Emma and Sophie had known each other for so long that neither of them could remember a time when the other wasn't there. It wasn't something they ever questioned. It simply felt like part of life. They grew up together. The same streets, the same school, the same familiar paths that over time stopped feeling noticeable at all. As children, they spent entire days side by side, sometimes talking without stopping, sometimes sitting quietly, doing different things, but still sharing the same space. And that feeling stayed with them, even as they grew older, even when life slowly became more complicated. At school, people used to say that if you saw one of them, the other would be somewhere nearby. And most of the time, that was true. They shared everything in a way that didn't require explanation. Thoughts, plans, small details that didn't seem important to anyone else. It was the kind of friendship that felt stable, not something fragile, not something that needed attention to survive, just something that existed. University didn't change that. They had different schedules, different responsibilities, but they still found their way back to each other at the end of the day, talking, sharing, continuing everything as if nothing had really changed. After graduation, staying together didn't feel like a decision. It felt like the only natural step. They moved to the city, found jobs in the same company, rented a small apartment that wasn't perfect, but felt comfortable in a quiet, familiar way. Their evenings were simple. They would come home tired, make something to eat, talk about work, about people, about things that didn't matter outside of those walls. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they didn't say much at all. But there was always an understanding between them, a quiet sense that nothing really needed to be explained. And maybe that's why neither of them noticed when something began to change. Not suddenly, not in a way that stood out, just something small, something that at the time didn't feel important at all. It started in a way that didn't seem important at first. Small moments that didn't stand out from everything else in Emma's life. At work, new people were constantly coming and going, and she had learned not to pay too much attention to most of them. But Lucas was different in a way she couldn't immediately explain. He wasn't loud. He didn't try to be noticed. He simply felt present, calm in his way of speaking, careful in the way he listened. There was nothing dramatic about him. Nothing that would make anyone think he would stay in her thoughts longer than a passing conversation. Their first interactions were simple, work-related, short exchanges in the office, a few shared tasks. Nothing that carried any meaning beyond the moment. But slowly, without any clear reason, Emma started noticing him more often. Not because he changed, but because she did. Sophie noticed him too. At first, just casually. A comment here, a passing observation there. Something about how he seems like a decent guy. Emma didn't think much of it. There was no reason to. Her life was already full, stable, predictable in the way she had grown used to. But something about Lucas stayed in the background of her thoughts, not loudly, not insistently, just quietly there. Like a detail you don't realize you've memorized until you see it again. Days passed like that. Work, home, routine conversations with Sophie in the evenings. Everything continued as before, and Lucas remained just a small part of that structure. Until one evening, something shifted slightly, not in a visible way, not in a way anyone else would notice, but for Emma, it felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. After that evening, Emma started noticing Lucas more often. Not because anything had changed between them, but because her attention no longer passed over him so easily. It was still nothing obvious, just small moments. A short conversation that lasted a little longer than necessary. A shared laugh in the office that stayed in her mind longer than it should have. The kind of details most people forget before the day even ends. Lucas remained the same. Calm, steady, uncomplicated in the way he treated others. There was no attempt to impress, no pressure to be anything other than what he was. And somehow, that made him harder to ignore. Sophie continued to mention him occasionally, not in a serious way, more like passing comments, half jokes, small observations that didn't seem important. Emma usually smiled and didn't think much of it. But something subtle had already started to shift, not in her actions, not in her decisions, but in how she experienced ordinary moments. Workdays felt slightly different when Lucas was around. Not easier, not harder, just more noticeable. As if the background of her routine had gained a new detail she couldn't unsee. One afternoon, they ended up talking longer than usual. It wasn't planned, it wasn't meaningful in any dramatic sense. just a natural continuation of a conversation that didn't end when it normally should have. And when it was over, Emma found herself thinking about it later that night, not because of what was said, but because of how effortless it had felt. As if for a brief moment, time had stopped demanding anything from her. She didn't tell Sophie about it. There was nothing to tell. At least, that's what she told herself. But from that point on, something quiet had begun to exist between them. Not a relationship, not even a direction, just a presence, something that hadn't fully formed yet, but also hadn't gone away. Sophia was the first to notice the change, not in a dramatic way, not through anything obvious, just small things that didn't quite match the usual rhythm between them. The way Emma sometimes became quieter after work, the way her attention drifted during conversations, as if part of her was somewhere else. The way certain names began appearing more often in casual talk. Lucas. Sophie didn't ask direct questions at first. There was no reason to. But she started paying attention. And slowly her attitude toward Lucas began to shift. At first it was subtle. A comment here, a suggestion there. Nothing that sounded negative on the surface, more like concern, like careful advice. He seems a bit distant. Are you sure he's the right type of person for you? People at work can be different from what they look like. Emma usually brushed it off. She didn't see any reason to take it seriously. Lucas had never given her a reason not to trust him, and Sophie had always been protective. That's how Emma explained it to herself, but the comments didn't stop. They became slightly more frequent, slightly more specific, until they started to feel less like casual observations and more like quiet warnings. At the same time, Emma began noticing something else. Small tensions that hadn't been there before. Moments where Lucas and Sophie were in the same space and something felt slightly off. Nothing open. Nothing that could be pointed out. Just an invisible resistance that she couldn't fully understand. Lucas remained polite, respectful, unchanged in how he treated her. But Sophie's words stayed in Emma's mind longer than she expected them to. And for the first time, something uncomfortable began to form between certainty and doubt. Not about Lucas, not yet, but about the way she was being pulled in two different directions. One she could feel, and one she had always trusted. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly in moments that seemed too small to matter. At work, things with Lucas were still polite, still normal on the surface. But Emma started noticing a change in the atmosphere whenever Sophie was around. Conversations became shorter. Laughter disappeared faster. Even simple interactions felt slightly restrained, as if something unspoken was sitting between them. Sophia, on the other hand, grew more distant in a quiet way, not cold, not openly upset, just less open than before. She still talked to Emma every day, still lived with her, still shared the same routines, but something in her tone had changed, a carefulness, a measured way of speaking, as if she was choosing every word more carefully than before. Emma tried not to think too much about it. People change, friendships shift. That's what she told herself. But at the same time, Lucas had become a more constant presence in her thoughts. Not overwhelming, just steady. Like a quiet direction her attention kept returning to without permission. One evening after work, Lucas offered to help Emma finish a small task she had stayed late for. It was simple, nothing unusual, but Sophie happened to be there when it ended. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched. And Emma noticed something in her expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not surprise, something more controlled than that. Something harder to read. Later that night, Sophie was quieter than usual. She answered questions normally. She smiled when needed, but there was a distance in her presence that Emma couldn't ignore anymore. It was the first time Emma felt it clearly, that whatever was happening was no longer just about Lucas. It was also about them, about the space between two people who had never really had to question their place in each other's lives before. And for the first time, Emma didn't feel completely sure where she stood in that space. After that, things didn't break. They just shifted. Barely noticeable at first, but enough that Emma could feel it every day. At home, Sophie started spending more time alone in her room, not in a way that felt dramatic or intentional, just small changes in routine. Less conversation in the evenings, shorter answers. More silence between them. Emma tried to fill it the way she always had before. Small talk, work stories, light topics that used to come naturally. But something was different now. The ease between them wasn't there in the same way. At work, Lucas remained consistent, calm, patient, as if nothing around him had changed at all. And that contrast made everything more confusing for Emma, because in one part of her life, everything felt slightly colder, and in the other, strangely steady. One afternoon, Sophie made a comment that stayed with Emma longer than expected. It wasn't loud, it wasn't direct, just a simple sentence, said almost casually, "Just be careful not to mix feelings with work too much." Emma didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't hear it, but because she couldn't tell where it came from. Concern or something else. That night, she replayed it in her mind more than once, trying to find a clear meaning in it. But nothing felt certain anymore. Not Lucas, not Sophie. Not even herself in the way she was starting to react to everything. What made it worse was that no one said anything directly. Everything was implied. Everything was between the lines. And silence, Emma realized, could be just as heavy as words. Days passed like that. A quiet tension that never fully exploded, but also never disappeared. And somewhere in that growing distance, Emma started to understand something she didn't want to admit. The life she thought was stable was no longer as simple as it used to be. It started changing in a way Emma could no longer ignore. So I was no longer just distant. She was active. Not openly, not in a way that could be directly pointed out, but in small actions that began to add up. She started appearing more often in conversations where Lucas was mentioned, offering opinions that sounded careful but firm. He doesn't really open up much, does he? Some people are like that at work, but outside it's different. Emma noticed it, but still tried to stay neutral. She didn't want to turn small observations into something bigger than they were. But over time, Sophie's words began to settle in her mind in a different way. They stopped being just comments. They became questions she didn't ask herself before. At the same time, Sophie started spending more time around Lucas, not directly with him, but always in situations where she could observe. Short exchanges, brief conversations, moments that didn't look unusual from the outside, but Emma began to feel it, a pattern she couldn't quite define. Lucas never changed how he behaved. He remained polite, calm, consistent, but Sophie's presence around him felt different than before, more intentional, more focused. One evening, Emma came home later than usual. Sophie was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting, not angry, not emotional, just quiet in a way that felt heavier than anything she had said before. Emma asked what was wrong. Sophie smiled slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just don't think you see everything clearly," she said. Emma paused. That sentence didn't sound like advice anymore. It sounded like certainty. And for the first time, she felt something shift inside her understanding of Sophie. Not fully breaking, but no longer simple. no longer just friendship. Something was forming beneath it, something she couldn't yet name. And Lucas, without even being present in the room, had somehow become the center of it. Emma started to notice how easily doubt can grow when no one says anything directly. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had been clearly said. But the feeling was there now, sitting quietly behind every interaction. At work, Lucas still behaved the same way, calm, respectful, consistent. But Emma found herself watching him more closely than before, trying to notice something she might have missed, some small detail that would explain the tension she was beginning to feel. Sophie, on the other hand, had changed in a different way. She was no longer just making comments. She was guiding conversations, steering Emma's thoughts without forcing them. Don't you think he's a bit too closed off? People like that don't always show who they really are. Emma would listen. Sometimes she would respond. Sometimes she wouldn't. But the words stayed with her longer than she wanted them to. And slowly, something started to happen inside her. Not trust breaking, not love disappearing, but certainty becoming less stable. One evening, Lucas asked Emma to stay a little later at work. Nothing unusual, just finishing something together. It should have felt normal. And it did, until Sophia showed up unexpectedly. She didn't say much, just greeted them briefly, but Emma noticed how quickly the atmosphere changed. Lucas became more reserved. Sophie became more observant. And Emma, standing between them, suddenly felt something she couldn't explain. Like she was no longer seeing a situation clearly, but through different versions of it. Later that night, Sophie said something that didn't sound like a question anymore. It sounded like a conclusion. I just don't want you to get hurt. Emma didn't answer immediately, because she didn't know anymore if that sentence was about care or control. And for the first time, she realized that the space between truth and influence could be very small. Small enough to miss, until it was already affecting everything. Something began to change in Emma's decisions. Not suddenly, not in a way she could clearly point to, but in small choices that slowly started to shift her direction. She began to hesitate more when it came to Lucas. Messages she would normally answer quickly stayed unread longer than before. Conversations that used to feel simple now carried an extra weight she couldn't explain. And every time she tried to ignore it, Sophie's voice would quietly return in her mind, not as a command, not as pressure, but as a suggestion that slowly started to feel like caution. At work, Lucas noticed the distance. He didn't confront her. He didn't push. He simply remained the same, calm, patient, but quieter around her than before. As if he understood something had changed, even if it was never said out loud. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed more certain now, more stable in her position. She no longer questioned things. She stated them, even if softly. "You just need to be careful," she would say. "Sometimes people don't show who they really are at first." Emma started to feel trapped between two kinds of silence. Lucas, who didn't explain himself, and Sophie, who explained too much. And in that space between them, Emma slowly began to lose clarity. One evening, she came home earlier than usual. Sophie was already there, waiting. This time, not quietly, but with something more deliberate in her presence. She looked at Emma for a long moment before speaking. "I think you already know," she said softly. Emma froze because she didn't know what she was supposed to know. Or maybe she was afraid that she did. And that was the moment everything started moving towards something she could no longer slow down. Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening between them had stopped being subtle. It was now present in every space she walked into. At work, Lucas was still polite, still steady, but there was a distance in him that hadn't been there before. Not resentment, not anger, more like resignation. As if he had started accepting something without being told what it was. Emma felt that shift every time she saw him, and it unsettled her more than she expected. At home, Sophie no longer pretended things were neutral. She didn't hide her opinions anymore. She simply said them calmly, as if they were facts she had already accepted long ago. "You always choose what feels easiest in the moment," she said one evening. Emma looked at her, unsure how to respond, because it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like something Sophie had been carrying for a long time, and that made it heavier. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't comfortable anymore. It wasn't shared. It was divided. Two people in the same room, no longer standing in the same place emotionally. Later that week, Lucas asked to speak with Emma, just for a moment, away from everything else. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't try to convince her of anything. He only said, "I feel like you're listening to everyone except yourself." It stayed with her longer than anything Sophie had said, because it didn't sound like influence. It sounded like truth she hadn't wanted to face. And for the first time, Emma realized she wasn't just caught between two people. She was caught between two versions of herself, one that trusted history, and one that was starting to question everything she had built her certainty on. And somewhere in that space, the final truth was getting closer. After that conversation, Emma stopped sleeping properly. Not because something had changed overnight, but because she could no longer ignore the feeling that something important was just out of reach. At work, she started observing Lucas differently. Not with doubt exactly, but with a tension that felt heavier than before. She noticed things she had previously overlooked. The way he never raised his voice. The way he never tried to defend himself against things that weren't said directly. The way he simply stayed consistent, even when everything around him was shifting. And that consistency started to feel like something she didn't understand anymore. Sophia, meanwhile, became more direct, less careful with her words, less patient with silence. "You're making things more complicated than they are," she said one morning. Emma looked at her for a long time. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if Sophie was trying to help her or guide her. The difference no longer felt clear. That evening, Emma stayed late at work alone. No meetings, no distractions, just silence. And in that silence, everything she had been avoiding started to rise to the surface. Memories, moments, small details she hadn't connected before, the way Sophia always seemed to appear at the exact right moment, the way her opinions slowly became Emma's doubts, the way Lucas, over time, stopped trying to explain anything at all. Emma realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think until now. Nothing had ever been said directly, but everything had still been shaped. And when she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat there, realizing that whatever the truth was, it was no longer something she could delay. It was already standing right in front of her. Emma didn't go home right away. She stayed in the empty office long after everyone had left, staring at the quiet space as if it could somehow give her clarity. But it didn't. All it gave her was silence. And in that silence, everything she had been avoiding finally came together. Not as assumptions, not as feelings, but as something she could no longer ignore. She thought about Sophie. Every concern, every warning, every carefully chosen sentence that had slowly changed the way Emma saw Lucas. And then she thought about Lucas, not as a question anymore, but as someone who had always stayed the same while everything around him shifted. For the first time, she understood something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't that Lucas had changed. It was that her perception of him had been rewritten, piece by piece, without her noticing when it started. Emma's hands tightened slightly around her phone, and after a long pause, she made a decision. She would see him one last time. Lucas agreed without hesitation. They met in a quiet place near the office. There was no anger when he saw her, no frustration, only something tired and deeply calm, as if he had already accepted that this moment would eventually come. Emma struggled to speak at first, but when she finally did, her voice was steady. "I need to understand," she said. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, not defensive, not surprised, just honest. And then he said the words that broke everything she thought she knew. "I never told you what to think about me," he said quietly. "I only stayed the same while others told you who I was." Silence followed, heavy, complete. And in that silence, Emma finally saw it. Not a betrayal from him, not a hidden truth, but something far more painful. How easily trust can be shaped when it's filtered through someone else's voice. Later that night, Emma sat alone, realizing that the loudest influence in her life had never been words spoken directly, but words spoken through someone she never questioned, Sophie, the person she trusted most. And that realization didn't feel like anger at first. It felt like loss. A loss of something she had believed was unbreakable. Not just a relationship, but certainty itself. Sometimes the truth is not loud. It's just slowly revealed when it's already too late to ignore it. What Emma realized was not just about Lucas or Sophie, but about how easily trust can be shaped when we never question the people closest to us. And in the end, what hurt the most was not betrayal itself, but the realization that she had never seen the full picture.